The silence was a physical thing, a weight of sterilized air that pressed against his eardrums. It was the color of the walls, a flat, non-reflective white that swallowed light and offered no shadow. Unit 734, or Alien, as a forgotten voice had once called him, existed in a state of perpetual sensory deprivation, a carefully curated void designed to measure his deficiencies. The floor was cool and seamless beneath his bare feet, the only texture in his world the thin, synthetic weave of his uniform. He sat on the edge of the cot, a slab of memory foam fused to the wall, his posture a study in stillness. His world was composed of three elements: the white room, the nutrient paste delivered through a slot in the door, and the soft, incessant hum of the environmental controls. It was a sound so constant it had become a part of the silence itself. He measured time by the subtle shifts in the room's ambient temperature, the almost imperceptible dimming of the ceiling panel that simulated a night he had never seen. Today, the air held a new charge, a faint tremor of ozone that was not part of the standard atmospheric composition. Something was different. Something was wrong. Or perhaps, for the first time, something was right. He lifted a hand, turning it over in the flat, clinical light. The skin was pale, translucent, the blue of his veins a faint cartography beneath the surface. He was an Omega, a designation that meant less than nothing. He was a failed specimen, an Omega without a scent, without a cycle, without the biological imperatives that gave his kind value in the pristine, orderly world of the Spire. The Syndicate's physicians had documented his abnormalities with a detached, clinical fascination. They had prodded and sampled and scanned, their voices murmuring about recessive genes and neurological misfirings. He was not a person. He was a data point. He was not a being. He was a problem to be solved. And they had been trying to solve him for 22 years. He closed his eyes, the movement slow, deliberate. Behind his eyelids, there was no darkness, only a memory of the same sterile white. He focused on the hum, letting it vibrate through the bones of his skull. The ozone tang grew stronger, accompanied by a distant, concussive thud that was felt more than heard, a shudder that ran through the floor and up his spine. It was chaos, a foreign concept. His existence was the antithesis of chaos. It was order distilled to its most sterile, suffocating essence. Another thud, closer this time. A flicker in the light panel above. His heart, a sluggish and well-behaved organ, gave a painful lurch. He had been planning this, not in the conventional sense of blueprints and timetables, but in the slow, meticulous way a prisoner learns the rhythms of his guards. He had observed the minute degradations in the system, the fractional delays in the nutrient delivery, the increased frequency of diagnostic scans that suggested a growing urgency, a frustration within his keepers. They were reaching a conclusion, and conclusions in a place like this were always final. He knew, with a certainty that was as cold and hard as the floor, that his time as a living data point was ending. The next step was dissection, decommissioning. His body would provide one final set of readings before being incinerated. The thought held no terror, only a profound sense of waste. He was not afraid of dying. He was afraid of having never lived. The distant sounds of disruption were not a threat. They were an opportunity, a crack in the perfect white shell of his prison. He stood, his movements fluid, economical. There was no wasted motion in him. The Syndicate had trained that out. He walked to the door, a seamless plane of metal set flush with the wall. He pressed his palm against it. Cool, smooth, impassable. But the tremor had shaken something loose in the world, and perhaps something loose in him. He remembered the schematics, not from a screen or a data pad, but from the inside of his own mind. During one of the more invasive neural scans, a technician had been careless, leaving a diagnostic overlay of the facility active on a secondary monitor in his peripheral vision. Elian, feigning a medically induced stupor, had absorbed it all, every conduit, every junction, every flaw. A ghost map imprinted on his memory. He knew that behind the wall to the left of the door, 3 centimeters behind the polished composite panel, ran a primary power conduit. And he knew that the nutrient paste, for all its blandness, was a complex colloidal suspension with a high electrolytic content. It was, in the right circumstances, conductive. He moved to the nutrient slot, his pulse now a steady, hammering beat against his ribs. The day's ration was still there, a small, sealed container of grey sludge. He peeled back the foil, the sound unnaturally loud in the silence. He didn't eat it. He carried it to the wall beside the door, his fingers searching for a hairline seam he knew was there, the junction of 2 massive panels. He found it. Using his nail, he began to scrape, meticulously, patiently, working the thick paste into the tiny crevice. He worked until the container was empty, the grey line almost invisible against the white. Then he went to the small circular drain in the floor, the only other feature of the room. He placed his hands on either side of the grate and pulled. His muscles, though lean, were efficient. The syndicate kept their specimens in peak physical condition for the sake of accurate readings. The grate resisted, then groaned, the sound of metal scraping metal, a desecration of the quiet. He lifted it free. Below was a shallow basin and a pipe leading into the facility's plumbing. But what he needed was the small, recessed panel for the room's water reclamation system. Another schematic memorized from a stolen glance. He reached into the opening, his fingers finding the latches. A click. The panel swung open, revealing a cluster of bundled wires. He selected 2, their insulation colored according to a universal code he had somehow been born knowing. He stripped the ends with his teeth, the plastic acrid on his tongue. The taste of it, the first distinct flavor he had experienced in years, was a shock. He attached one wire to the metal of the grate. The other he held, his knuckles white. He took a deep breath, the sterilized air feeling thin, inadequate. He walked back to the nutrient-filled seam. He pressed the bare end of the second wire deep into the paste. The moment it made contact, a blinding blue arc of light erupted from the wall, tracing the path of the conduit. The hum of the room died. The light panel went dark. The silence was no longer a presence. It was an absence, a true, terrifying, absolute void. For a second, he was blind, adrift. Then a new sound, the hiss of the door's magnetic lock disengaging, a heavy clunk. A thin, vertical line of red emergency light appeared as the door slid open just a few centimeters. Freedom was a sliver of crimson in a world of black. He did not hesitate. He slipped through the gap, his thin frame barely fitting, and ran. The corridor beyond was a nightmare of flashing red lights and the shriek of alarms. He ignored it. He was not running from the chaos. He was running into it. He was a ghost leaving a white tomb, his bare feet silent on the cold metal floor, chasing a life he could only imagine. He was not an asset. He was not an experiment. He was Elian, and he was free. The air in the murk was thick enough to taste. It coated his tongue with the flavors of damp earth, ozone, and decay, a complex bouquet that was the polar opposite of the filtered sterility he had breathed his entire life. It was overwhelming. His lungs, accustomed to nothing, burned with the sheer richness of it. Rain, a phenomenon he had only understood as a variable in atmospheric reports, fell in a steady, chilling drizzle, plastering his thin uniform to his skin and tracing cold paths down his neck. The murk was a chasm carved into the city's foundations, a sprawling, chaotic network of canyons and tunnels beneath the gleaming, sterile perfection of the spire. Here, light was not a given. It bled down from the distant sky level in hazy shafts, catching on the perpetual smog, or it sputtered from jury-rigged neon signs that cast lurid pools of pink and green onto the wet, cobbled streets. Wires like tangled black vines drooped overhead, dripping water that sizzled on exposed power conduits. The sounds were a cacophony that vibrated in his bones, the hiss of steam from grates, the distant clang of metal on metal, the murmur of 1,000 voices layered one on top of the other, and the constant, bass-heavy thrum of machinery that was the city's dark, beating heart. For a being raised in silence, it was a physical assault. Every nerve ending screamed. He pressed himself into the shadows of an alcove, his body trembling not from cold, but from sheer sensory overload. He had been running for hours, moving through maintenance tunnels and forgotten service conduits, following the ghost map in his head downwards, always downwards, away from the white light of the spire. He was a creature of absolute order, cast into a world of pure chaos, and he was hopelessly, terrifyingly lost. The map in his mind had ended at the last official checkpoint, the final barrier between the regulated lower levels and the untamed territory of the murk. Beyond that, there was only rumor and shadow. He was an anomaly here. The people who passed him in the narrow, crowded streets were a riot of texture and scent. Their clothes were patched and layered, their faces etched with lives he couldn't comprehend. They carried the powerful, pheromonal sense of their designations: acrid, spicy alpha, warm, floral omega, steady, grounding beta. His own scentless state, once a mark of his defectiveness, was now his only camouflage. He was a blank slate, a ghost who moved through the scented world unseen, unnoticed. But he was also vulnerable. He had nothing. No currency, no connections, no knowledge of the intricate social codes that governed this subterranean world. The syndicate would be hunting him. Their enforcers, the sterile, white-armored wardens, would not be constrained by jurisdiction. They would come for their property. His only hope was to find the one power in the murk that could rival the syndicate's reach, a name whispered in the lower levels with a mixture of fear and reverence: Kalen, the alpha of the underground, the king of this sprawling, forgotten empire. Finding him was another matter. He was a myth, a phantom who ruled from the shadows. Asking for him directly was a death sentence, a surefire way to attract the wrong kind of attention. So Elian watched. He observed. It was the one skill his sterile life had given him. He found a perch in the rafters of a vast, cavernous marketplace, a hollowed-out cistern filled with stalls selling everything from scavenged tech to synthetic proteins. He watched the flow of power, the subtle deference shown to certain individuals, the way goods and information moved through the crowd like currents in a river. He learned to distinguish the foot soldiers from the lieutenants, the information brokers from the muscle. and he noticed that all the significant currents eventually flowed toward one place, a monolithic, blackened structure of rust and iron that loomed in the deepest part of the murk, a repurposed ore-processing plant known only as the Forge. Days bled into one another. Hunger became a dull, constant ache. The cold was a relentless companion. He slept in ventilation shafts, the roar of the fans a lullaby of industrial noise. He drank condensation that dripped from pipes and ate what he could steal, a half-eaten protein bar, a discarded piece of fruit, its sweetness an explosion on his deprived palate. He grew thinner, his face sharper, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion, but his resolve hardened into a cold, sharp point. He was no longer just running from the spire. He was running toward something, toward a single, desperate gamble. Finally, he made his move. He followed a known lieutenant, a grim-faced beta with a network of cybernetic optics in place of her left eye, as she made her way toward the Forge. He didn't trail her directly, but moved parallel, using the upper levels, the gantries and pipes that crisscrossed the chasm. He moved with the silence and grace of a wraith, a skill honed by a lifetime of trying to be invisible. The guards at the entrance to the Forge were immense, augmented alphas who radiated an aura of contained violence. They checked the lieutenant's credentials and waved her through a colossal iron door that groaned shut behind her. There was no way in, not for him. But Elian wasn't looking at the door. He was looking up. Along the corroded face of the structure, a massive, defunct exhaust chimney rose like a rusted spine into the smog-choked darkness above. Its base was 30 meters up, accessible only by a series of decaying maintenance ladders. It was an impossible climb. It was the only way. The climb was a fever dream of rusted metal, slick with grime and rain. The wind howled through the canyons of the murk, trying to tear him from his precarious hold. His muscles screamed, his palms were raw, but he kept moving. His focus narrowed to the next handhold, the next rung. He was fueled by a cold, clear desperation that burned away fear. When he finally hauled himself over the lip of the chimney, he was shaking, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The inside was a vertical tunnel of absolute blackness. He used the internal service ladder, descending into the heart of the Forge, into the den of the beast. The air grew warmer, thick with the scent of hot metal, oil, and something else. A powerful, dominant alpha scent, so pure and potent it was almost a physical presence. It smelled of ozone after a lightning strike, of dark soil and something metallic, like blood. It was a scent of absolute, uncompromising control, and it was drawing him downward, a lodestone for his desperation. The throne room was not a room at all, but the vast, cathedral-like heart of the old ore processor, a cavern of iron and shadow lit by the molten glow of the still active smelters that pulsed in the depths below, casting long, dancing shadows up the rust-streaked walls. Gantries and catwalks formed a spiderweb of metal overhead, and the air hummed with the low thrum of powerful machinery. At the center of it all, on a raised dais forged from blackened steel and salvaged tech, sat Kalen. He was not what Elian had expected. There was no ostentatious display of power, no gold, no finery. The Alpha wore simple, dark fatigues, the fabric stained with grease and use. He was built not with the sculpted, aesthetic musculature of a spire Alpha, but with the dense, functional strength of a laborer. His dark hair was cut short, his face sharp and angular, handsome in a severe, uncompromising way. But his presence, His presence was absolute. It filled the cavernous space, a quiet, gravitational pull that bent the world around him. He wasn't sitting on a throne. The throne was simply the place where he had chosen to rest. He was listening to the report of the cybernetically enhanced beta, his expression unreadable, his eyes a pale, piercing grey that seemed to absorb the light. Elian watched from the shadows of a high gantry, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. This was the man who held life and death in his hands for the entire Mreg. This was the power that could save him or erase him. He took a breath, the air thick with the alpha's scent. It should have been intimidating, oppressive. An Omega's biology should have screamed for submission, but Elian's biology was broken. He felt only a strange, clinical curiosity, and the cold, sharp edge of his own desperation. He needed to be seen, but he needed to do it on his own terms. He dropped, not a clumsy fall, but a controlled descent, landing with a soft thud on the metal catwalk 10 meters below, the sound deliberately calculated to be just loud enough to draw attention. Every head in the chamber snapped towards him. The guards tensed, their hands moving to weapons. The beta whirled, her optic eye glowing red as it zoomed in on him. But Kalen didn't move. He simply lifted his head, those pale grey eyes locking onto Elian's. The silence that fell was more profound than any noise. It was a silence of pure, predatory focus. "Hold," Kalen said. His voice was a low baritone, calm and measured, yet it carried the effortless authority of a command that had never been disobeyed. The guards froze. Elian stood perfectly still on the gantry, meeting the alpha's gaze. He was a wraith caught in a searchlight, pale and thin in his white uniform, a stark anomaly in this world of iron and shadow. He looked like a piece of the spire that had broken off and fallen into the darkness. "You are a long way from home, little ghost," Kalen said, his voice resonating in the vast space. It wasn't a question. "The wardens don't often lose their pets." Elian's chin lifted a fraction. "I am not a pet." His own voice was quiet, hoarse from disuse, but steady. It held no tremor, no fear, only a flat, factual certainty. A flicker of something, interest, amusement, crossed Kalen's face. He gestured with one hand, a small, economical movement. "Come down." Elian walked the length of the gantry and descended a narrow spiral staircase, each step echoing in the charged silence. He stopped at the foot of the dais, his head held high, his gaze unwavering. He was acutely aware of his own state, filthy, exhausted, dressed in the sterile uniform of his prison. He was a beggar, a supplicant, but he would not act like one. He met Kalen's eyes. "I require sanctuary." Kalen leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. The movement was slow, deliberate, like a great cat settling in to watch its prey. The molten light from below cast his face in harsh relief, all sharp planes and deep shadows. "Sanctuary has a cost. Everything in the Mreg has a cost. I am a purveyor of commodities, not charity." Elian had anticipated this. "I have no currency." "Everyone has something to trade," Kalen countered, his voice soft, almost conversational. And then he delivered the line that was his legend, his philosophy, the core of his empire. "Everyone has a price." Elian felt the weight of that statement, the cynical, transactional truth of the world it described. But he was not of this world, or any world. He was a creature of the void, and he had nothing to lose. "The Syndicate wants me back," Elian stated, his voice clinical. "They are mobilizing resources, Their wardens will enter the murk. They will disrupt your operations. They will violate your borders. They will do this not because I am valuable as a person, but because of what I know. A predatory stillness settled over Kalen. And what is it that you know, little ghost, that is worth so much to them? This was the gamble, the one card he had to play. I know their systems, their infrastructure, their security protocols. I know the schematics of every detention facility and medical wing in the upper sectors. I know their vulnerabilities. He paused, letting the silence stretch. They did not keep me in a room. They kept me in their central nervous system. I was a part of the machine, and I learned its shape. Kalen was silent for a long time. His pale eyes searched Elian's face, looking for a lie, for a crack in the calm facade. He found none. There was only the cold, hard truth of desperation. You offer me the Syndicate's secrets, Kalen said slowly, in exchange for my protection. I offer you a weapon, Elian corrected softly. A weapon to use against a common enemy. My price is my survival. Your reward is their weakness. A slow smile touched Kalen's lips. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of a predator that has just spotted a new, very interesting weakness in its rival's defenses. You are not like the others, he murmured, more to himself than to Elian. He looked at the Omega before him, scentless, emotionless, defiant, a broken thing that refused to act broken. Very well, Kalen said, his voice once again carrying its effortless command. You have your sanctuary, for now. He leaned back, the movement casual, but his eyes held a new, calculating light. Show him to the west wing, he ordered the beta. He is my guest. The word guest hung in the air, laden with unspoken meaning. It meant protected. It meant watched. It meant property. Elian had traded one cage for another, but this one, at least, had shadows. And in the shadows, he thought, a ghost might just learn how to disappear, or how to fight. The west wing of the forge was a stark contrast to the brutalist heart of the complex. It was a series of chambers carved from what had once been the administrative offices of the ore plant, retrofitted with a surprising degree of Spartan luxury. The room he was given was spacious, the walls bare, polished concrete, the floor covered with a thick, dark rug that absorbed sound. A wide bed with a heavy fur throw dominated one wall, and a single vast window of reinforced plasteel looked out, not onto the chaotic streets of the murk, but into a colossal, enclosed atrium. It was a biome, a contained ecosystem of impossible greenery. Bioluminescent fungi cast a soft blue-green light on ferns and thick, mossy vines that climbed the iron girders. A waterfall cascaded down a rock face into a deep, dark pool, the sound a constant, soothing murmur. It was a captured piece of a world that no longer existed, a private, living jewel in the heart of the rust and iron. It was Kalen's sanctuary, and now it was Elian's gilded cage. He stood before the window for a long time, watching the slow, rhythmic pulse of the glowing moss. After the absolute white of his cell and the sensory violence of the murk, the quiet, contained beauty of this place was disorienting. It was a cage, yes, but it was the most beautiful cage he had ever seen. The beta, whose name he learned was Syra, had left him with a stack of clean clothes, soft, dark fabrics that felt alien against his skin, and a tray of food, real food, roasted root vegetables, a piece of savory grilled meat, and a cup of water that tasted clean, but not sterile. It tasted of minerals, of the earth. He ate slowly, methodically, cataloguing the sensations. The smoky char of the meat, the earthy sweetness of the vegetables. It was data, but for the first time, it was data his body welcomed, data that felt like life. For 2 days, he was left entirely alone. He explored the confines of his chambers, the main room, a bathing chamber with a deep tub and steaming, geothermally heated water, and a small antechamber with a desk and a datapad. The datapad was locked, its screen dark and inert. He was a guest, but a prisoner nonetheless. He slept, his body finally succumbing to the bone-deep exhaustion of his escape. He would wake from disjointed, colorless dreams of running down endless white corridors, the silence pressing in on him, only to be soothed by the gentle sound of the waterfall outside his window. He was being observed. He knew it without seeing the cameras. It was in the perfect ambient temperature of the room, in the way a fresh tray of food would appear silently in the antechamber while he bathed. It was a familiar feeling, this invisible scrutiny, but the intent behind it felt different. The syndicate had watched him for flaws. Kalen was watching him for what? Value, a weakness. The answer remained elusive. On the 3rd day, Kalen came to him. There was no announcement, no knock. The door to his chambers simply slid open, and the Alpha was there, his presence preceding him like a pressure wave. The air thickened, charged with his scent of ozone and dark earth. He was dressed as before, in functional dark clothing. He moved with a liquid grace that belied his solid frame, his footsteps silent on the rug. He stopped in the center of the room, his pale eyes taking in the sight of Elian, who stood by the window. Elian had dressed in the clothes provided, a simple black tunic and trousers. The dark color made his pale skin seem almost luminous in the soft blue-green light from the atrium. "You're recovering," Kalen stated. It wasn't a question. The nutrition in the spire is designed for maintenance, not vitality. "It is sufficient for baseline metabolic function," Elian replied, his tone even, clinical. He did not turn to face the Alpha, keeping his eyes on the impossible garden. Kalen moved to stand beside him, a few feet away, also looking out the window. The proximity was a tangible force. Elian's skin prickled, a strange, unfamiliar sensation. He catalogued it as an autonomic response to a dominant pheromonal presence, a biological reflex, nothing more. "Sufficient is the enemy of optimal," Kalen said, his voice a low murmur. "The spire is built on sufficiency, just enough freedom, just enough comfort, just enough hope to keep the machine running. They have forgotten what it means to thrive." He finally turned his head, his gaze settling on Elian's profile. "They told you that you were broken, an omega without a scent, a failure." The diagnostic term was pheromonal null, Elian corrected, his voice devoid of emotion. "It is a factual description of my condition." "It's a lie," Kalen said, his voice flat. Elian finally turned to look at him. The Alpha's expression was intense, his grey eyes searching. "No omega is a null. They can be suppressed, masked, damaged, but the biology is never absent. It's simply dormant." He took a step closer. Elian instinctively held his ground, a lifetime of conditioning screaming at him to show no weakness, no reaction. The Alpha's scent was stronger now, a clean, sharp smell, like lightning striking wet rock. It wasn't unpleasant. It was grounding. "They've been poisoning you since birth, little ghost," Kalen continued, his voice soft, dangerous. "A cocktail of suppressants and blockers woven into your nutrient paste, your water, the very air you breathe. They weren't trying to cure you. They were trying to create you. A scentless, controllable Omega. An experiment. And you, it seems, were the one subject who didn't respond as predicted. You didn't just go dormant. You fought it. Your system adapted, nullified their drugs. You broke their experiment just by existing. The words settled into the quiet space between them. Elian's mind, a place of cold logic and hard data, reeled. He had always accepted his condition as an inherent flaw, a genetic misprint. The idea that it was not a failing but a form of resistance was destabilizing. It felt like the floor tilting beneath his feet. "You have no evidence for this hypothesis," he said, his voice tight. "I have the evidence of my own senses," Kalen countered. He lifted a hand, not to touch, but to hover in the air near Elian's neck. Elian flinched, a small, almost imperceptible tremor. Kalen's hand stopped. When an Omega is suppressed, there is a chemical blankness, a void. But you are not a void. You are shielded. There is something there, under the silence, a potential, like the charge in the air before a storm. He let his hand drop. The tension in Elian's shoulders eased a fraction. "Why would they do it?" Elian asked, the question barely a whisper. "Why create a null control?" Kalen answered without hesitation. "The Syndicate's power is built on the predictable biology of designations. Alpha's lead, Beta's work, Omega's breed. It is a simple, effective system. But it is vulnerable to emotion, to the chaos of a rut, a heat, a bond. What if you could remove that? Create Omegas who are beautiful, compliant, but immune to the pheromonal tides that can sway even the most powerful alpha. They would be the perfect companions, the perfect political bargaining chips, incapable of forming a true bond, incapable of inspiring a disruptive passion. They would be living art, possessions, the ultimate symbol of status and control. The clinical cruelty of it was breathtaking. Elian thought of the White Room, the endless silence, the careful calibration of his existence. He was not a failed specimen. He was a prototype. He was not an asset. He was not an experiment. The words echoed in his mind, but this time they carried a new, horrifying weight. He had been designed to be the perfect slave, and his only crime had been his refusal to break. A cold fury, an emotion so alien it felt like it belonged to someone else, began to smolder deep within him. It was a tiny, hot ember in the frozen landscape of his soul. Kalen watched the subtle shift in his expression, the tightening of his jaw, the flicker of something new and dangerous in his eyes. "The weapon you offered me," Kalen said softly, "it is more powerful than you know. It's not just schematics and security codes. It's you. Your existence is a testament to their failure. You are the proof that their system of control is not absolute." He turned and walked toward the door. "Rest," he said over his shoulder. "Recover your strength. The Syndicate is not known for its patience. They will come looking for their lost property." The door slid shut, leaving Elian alone once more with the impossible garden and a truth that threatened to shatter the foundations of his world. He was not broken. He had been forged, and the fire was just beginning to burn. The first attack came without warning. It was not the overt, clumsy assault of a warden squadron breaching the main gates. It was subtle, insidious, a surgeon's strike into the heart of the murk. Elian was in the atrium, tracing the patterns of the bioluminescent moss with his fingers, the cool, damp texture, a novel sensation. He was trying to process Kalen's revelation, to reconcile the narrative of his life as a failure with this new, terrifying possibility. The idea that his body harbored a secret resistance was like a phantom limb. He could feel its shape, but couldn't quite believe it was real. A sudden, piercing shriek of feedback cut through the tranquil murmur of the waterfall. The soft, blue-green light of the fungi flickered and died, plunging the atrium into absolute darkness. Simultaneously, the door to his chambers hissed shut and locked, the sound of heavy bolts ramming home echoing in the sudden silence. His training, the ingrained reflexes of a lifetime in a hostile environment, took over. He didn't panic. He dropped into a low crouch, his back against the cool rock of the waterfall, his senses straining against the sudden deprivation. The darkness was absolute, deeper than the simulated night of his cell. The only sound was the cascade of water and the frantic, hammering beat of his own heart. He was blind, trapped. A new scent cut through the familiar damp earth of the atrium. It was antiseptic, sterile, the smell of a medbay with an acrid undertone of ozone. Not the natural ozone of Kalen's scent, but something artificial, chemical. It was the scent of the spire, the scent of his prison. A low hiss emanated from the center of the atrium. A gas. He held his breath, his mind racing. A neuro agent, most likely. Fast-acting, designed for incapacitation, not termination. They wanted him alive. He scrambled away from the sound, his hands brushing against the slick leaves of ferns. He needed to get higher. The gas would be heavier than air. He found the rough trunk of a climbing vine and began to pull himself up, his bare feet finding purchase on the rock face. His movements were silent, desperate. Below, he heard footsteps, soft, measured, the sound muffled by the damp earth. They were moving with tactical precision, fanning out. Target is designated Omega 734. A synthesized voice crackled, the sound distorted, inhuman. It was the voice of a warden, filtered through a helmet's comms. Acquisition protocol is non-lethal. Biosignature is null, but be advised, subject is a high-value fugitive. Use of tranq darts is authorized. Elian pressed himself flat against the rock wall, hidden behind a curtain of hanging moss. He could hear them moving below, their helmet lights cutting sharp, white cones through the oppressive dark. The beams sliced through the space where he had been moments before. He was a rat in a barrel, and they were flooding it with water. A sudden, explosive crash echoed from the direction of his chambers, the sound of reinforced metal being torn apart. Then, gunfire. Not the high-pitched whine of Warden pulse rifles, but the deep, guttural roar of projectile weapons. The sounds of the murk of Kalen's forces answering the intrusion. The wardens below paused, their movements freezing. Contact, the synthesized voice reported, its tone unchanged. Hostile forces engaging at the perimeter. Maintain objective. One of the light beams swung upwards, sweeping across the rock face. Elian held his breath, his muscles locked. The beam passed inches from his face, the light so bright it left a searing afterimage on his retinas. He felt a vibration through the rock, the concussive force of the firefight outside. The sterile scent of the gas was growing stronger, making his lungs burn, his head spin. He couldn't hold his breath forever. Just as his vision began to swim, a new presence flooded the atrium. It was not a sound or a light, but a scent. Kalen. It crashed into the space with the force of a physical blow, an overwhelming wave of pure, undiluted alpha dominance. Ozone, dark earth, and hot iron, a scent that screamed territory and rage. It was not the controlled, measured presence Elian had experienced before. This was a raw, primal force, a storm unleashed. The sterile chemical smell of the warden's presence was instantly smothered, annihilated. "Get out of my house," Kalen's voice boomed, not through a comms unit, but with the raw power of his own lungs. The sound vibrated through Elian's chest, a physical force. The darkness erupted into chaos. Elian heard the wardens cry out, their synthesized voices glitching with pain and surprise. There was the sound of bodies hitting the ground, the sickening crunch of armor collapsing under immense force. Kalen moved through the darkness, not like a man, but like a force of nature, a phantom of pure violence. Elian saw his silhouette for a bare second, a darker shape against the black, impossibly fast. In moments, it was over. The silence that fell was heavy, broken only by the sound of the waterfall and Kalen's harsh, ragged breathing. The emergency lights flickered on, casting the atrium in a dim, red glow. The scene was one of brutal efficiency. 3 white armored wardens lay twisted on the ground, their limbs at unnatural angles, their helmets cracked. They were unconscious, not dead. Kalen stood over them, his chest heaving. There was a dark gash on his forearm, bleeding sluggishly, but he seemed not to notice. His pale eyes scanned the atrium, searching. They found Elian, still clinging to the rock face 20 feet up. The raw fury in Kalen's expression softened, replaced by a fierce, focused concern. "Elian," he called out, his voice rough. "Are you harmed?" Elian shook his head, his throat too tight to speak. He slid down the vine, his landing unsteady. His legs felt weak, his head light from the lingering gas. Kalen was across the space in 3 long strides, his hands gripping Elian's shoulders, steadying him. The contact was electric, a jolt of warmth and strength that chased away the cold dread. "Breathe," Kalen commanded, his voice low and urgent. "Deep breaths. It's a mild neurotoxin. It will pass." Elian did as he was told, dragging air into his burning lungs. The Alpha's scent was all around him, a protective shield that seemed to physically push back against the chemical taint in the air. It was grounding, solid, real. He leaned into Kalen's hold, his forehead resting against the Alpha's shoulder, a gesture of unconscious, desperate trust. Kalen went still, his hands tightening for a second on Elian's shoulders before his grip gentled. He simply stood there, a bulwark against the chaos, letting Elian anchor himself. "They found a way through the geothermal vents," Syra's voice said from the ruined doorway. She stood amidst the wreckage, a heavy pulse rifle in her hands, her optic eye glowing a cool blue. "Sealed now. We have 2 more captives in the corridor." Kalen didn't take his eyes off Elian. "Sweep the entire sector. I want a full diagnostic on their gear, their comms, their biology. I want to know how they got this close." "Understood," Syra said, and was gone. Kalen gently guided Elian toward the undamaged section of the room, away from the sight of the fallen wardens. He sat him down on the edge of the bed. "They underestimated you," Kalen said, his voice regaining its usual calm, measured tone, though a dangerous edge remained. "They assumed a passive target. They didn't expect you to react." "They trained me to be observant," Elian murmured, his voice hoarse. "They never considered I would use that observation for my own survival." He looked at Kalen, at the blood dripping from the gash on his arm. "You're injured." Kalen glanced at his arm as if just noticing it. "It's nothing." He started to turn away, to deal with the aftermath, but Elian's hand shot out, his fingers wrapping around the Alpha's wrist. The contact was startling to them both. Elian's skin was cold, Kalen's was radiating heat. "Let me," Elian said, his voice quiet but firm. It was not a request. He pulled Kalen back to the bed, his movements precise. He went into the bathing chamber and returned with a clean cloth and a container from the small medical kit stored there. He knelt before the alpha, gently taking his arm. Kalen watched him, his expression unreadable, as Elian meticulously cleaned the wound. Elian's touch was clinical, efficient, the touch of someone familiar with medical procedures. But there was something else in it, a focused care that was anything but detached. He was not just cleaning a wound, he was repaying a debt. He was anchoring himself to the reality of this new, violent world. As he worked, his fingers brushed against the pulse point on Kalen's wrist. He felt the strong, steady beat of the alpha's heart. It was a rhythm of life, of power, of fury contained. And for the first time, Elian felt the answering beat of his own heart, not as a frantic tremor of fear, but as a steady, resonant echo. In the days following the attack, the forge changed. The quiet, almost lazy confidence of Kalen's empire was replaced by a coiled, watchful tension. Patrols were doubled. Checkpoints were reinforced. The low thrum of the Merc now carried a new undercurrent of readiness, of a fortress preparing for a siege. Kalen was a whirlwind of activity, his commands sharp and precise as he orchestrated the shoring up of his defenses. Yet every evening he would return to the chambers in the west wing. He would find Elian in the atrium, or reading at the desk, the datapad now unlocked and filled with information about the Merc, its history, its economy, its people. They would speak, their conversations circling the events of the day, the syndicate's probable next move, the information gleaned from the captured wardens. But beneath the tactical discussions, something else was growing, a quiet, fragile intimacy. Elian found himself observing Kalen not as a potential threat or a powerful ally, but as a person. He saw the exhaustion that sometimes shadowed the Alpha's sharp features, the weight of the responsibility he carried for the thousands of souls who lived under his protection. He learned to read the subtle shifts in his scent, the way the metallic tang of iron sharpened when he was angry, the way the dark earth note deepened when he was contemplative. Kalen, in turn, watched Elian's slow, hesitant blossoming. The change was subtle, but undeniable. Elian was beginning to experience the world not as a series of data points, but as a tapestry of sensations. He would spend hours in the atrium, not just looking at the plants, but touching them, smelling the damp soil, feeling the cool mist from the waterfall on his skin. He started to show preferences. He favored the tart, citrus-like fruit that grew on one of the vines, and the smoky tea that Syra brought him each morning. These small assertions of self were monumental. He was a man who had never been allowed a preference, and now he was discovering the landscape of his own desires. His past, however, was a constant, haunting presence. The unlocked datapad became a tool for his own investigation. He cross-referenced Kalen's hypothesis with the fragmented memories of his life. He pulled up medical terminology, pharmaceutical records scavenged from syndicate networks, and pieced together the horrifying truth. Kalen was right. He found records of Project Chimera, a top-secret initiative to engineer a new class of Omega. The project notes spoke of pheromonal nullification, of emotional dampening, of creating a being immune to the biological chaos of bonding. The lead researcher on the project was a name he knew, Director Aris Thorne, his father, The word felt alien, a designation without emotional context. Aris was the cold, distant man in a white coat who had overseen his biannual evaluations, the one who had looked at him not with paternal affection, but with the disappointed air of an engineer examining a flawed prototype. The revelation did not bring a storm of grief. It brought a cold, clarifying anger. The ember of fury he had felt before was now a steady, burning flame. He was the byproduct of one man's obsession with control, an obsession that mirrored the syndicate's own philosophy on a grand societal scale. One evening, as Kalen watched him stare at the datapad, his face a pale, taut mask, the Alpha spoke. "You found it." It wasn't a question. Elian looked up, his eyes seeming to hold a new, deeper darkness. "He was my sire," he said, the word clinical, detached. "The architect of the project." Kalen's expression hardened. "The sins of the father," he began, but Elian cut him off. "This is not his sin to bear alone," Elian said, his voice low and intense. "He is a product of the system, just as I am, a system that values control above connection, order above life. He is just the most perfect expression of its ideals." It was in that moment that Kalen saw him clearly for the first time, not as a victim, not as an asset, but as a survivor forged into a weapon. The cold, clinical mind that the syndicate had so carefully cultivated was now turned against them, analyzing their philosophies, their weaknesses, with terrifying precision. A strange, unfamiliar sensation began to stir in Elian's own body. It started as a low, deep ache in his bones, a strange heat coiling in his gut. He dismissed it as a psychosomatic response to stress. But it grew, day by day, a slow, inexorable tide rising within him. His senses sharpened to an almost painful degree. He could smell the rain on the wind an hour before it arrived. He could hear the faint, rhythmic drip of water in a pipe 3 rooms away. And Kalen's scent. Kalen's scent became a universe. He could distinguish every note, every subtle shift. It was a constant presence, a magnetic north that his newly awakening senses oriented themselves around. He started to feel restless. A deep primal urge to move, to do something, thrummed just beneath his skin. He found himself pacing the length of his chambers, the quiet solitude that had once been a comfort, now feeling like a constraint. One night, the feeling became unbearable. He felt hot, feverish. His skin was hypersensitive, the soft fabric of his clothes an abrasive torment. The scent of ozone and earth was a phantom on his tongue, a desperate craving. He stumbled into the bathing chamber, turning the water on as cold as it would go, and slid into the tub, hoping the shock would quell the firestorm inside him. It didn't work. It only made him shiver, his teeth chattering as the heat inside him raged unabated. A low sound of distress escaped his lips, an animal sound he didn't recognize as his own. The door to the bathing chamber slid open. Kalen stood there, silhouetted against the light from the main room. His face was grim, his eyes dark with a knowing intensity. The air was thick with Elian's distress, and something else. A faint, almost imperceptible scent was finally beginning to cling to him. It was sharp and clean, like the air after a winter storm, with an undercurrent of something green and wild, like crushed moss on wet stone. Petrichor and ozone, the scent of a storm breaking. "It's starting," Kalen said, his voice rough. "Your first heat." The words barely registered through the haze of fever and need. Elian curled in on himself, his body trembling. "Make it stop," he whispered, the words a raw plea. I can't. Kalen crossed the room in 2 strides and knelt by the tub. He didn't touch him. Not yet. I can't make it stop, Elian, he said, his voice gentle but firm. This isn't a sickness. It's you. It's your body finally waking up. After 22 years of silence, he reached out, his hand hovering over Elian's forehead. Let me help you. Elian looked up at him, his vision blurred, his rational mind swamped by a tidal wave of pure biological imperative. He saw the concern in the alpha's eyes, the tightly leashed control. He gave a single, desperate nod. Kalen's hand settled on his brow. His palm was cool, or maybe Elian's skin was just that hot. The alpha's scent washed over him, and this time Elian didn't just register it, he drank it in. It was the only thing that cut through the fever, the only thing that felt real. Kalen's thumb stroked his temple, a slow, soothing rhythm. It's all right, he murmured, his voice a low vibration that seemed to settle the frantic trembling in Elian's limbs. I'm here. You're not alone in this. Elian closed his eyes, surrendering to the overwhelming sensations, to the terrifying, liberating chaos of his own body, and to the steady, grounding presence of the one person who had seen the life buried beneath the silence. He was not broken. He was waking, and the storm was finally here. The heat was a crucible. It burned away the last vestiges of the sterile, detached being he had been, leaving something raw, new, and intensely alive. For 3 days, the world narrowed to the confines of the West Wing chambers, to the rise and fall of fever, and to Kalen's constant, grounding presence. The alpha did not leave his side. He brought him water, coaxed him to eat small bites of fruit, and spoke to him in a low, steady murmur when the waves of pain and pleasure became overwhelming. He was a rock in the storm of Elian's senses, his scent a lifeline. He never crossed a line, his touch always gentle, supportive, a hand on his brow, a steadying grip on his shoulder. He was a guardian, not a predator. It was a level of control and respect that Elian's logical mind found astounding, and that his newly awakened heart found devastating. In the lucid moments between the waves of fever, they talked. The formal barriers between them dissolved, burned away by the intimacy of the situation. Elian, stripped of his layers of clinical detachment, spoke of the white room, of the silence, of the profound, crushing loneliness. He did not speak with self-pity, but with the dawning wonder of a man describing a foreign country he had just escaped. Kalen, in turn, spoke of the murk. He spoke of his own past, of being a nameless orphan scrabbling for survival in the lower tunnels, of the brutal climb to power, of the moment he decided he would not just rule the darkness, but protect it. The Spire sees the murk as a garbage heap, he said, his voice low as he sat on a chair pulled up beside the bed. They see us as vermin, a problem to be managed. They don't understand that this is where life happens. Real life. It's messy and violent and unfair, but it's real. We are not their rejects. We are their foundation. We process their waste, power their city, and live in the darkness they are too afraid to face. Elian listened, and he understood. He and Kalen were 2 sides of the same coin, both forged in the crucible of the Syndicate's oppressive order. One was created by its sterile perfection, the other by its neglect. Both were survivors. Both were rebels. As the heat began to subside on the 3rd day, a profound change had settled over Elian. The fever broke, leaving him weak but clear-headed. The frantic, desperate edge of his new biology had softened into a steady, thrumming awareness. And his scent was now a permanent part of him. It was faint, but distinct, the clean, sharp smell of petrichor and winter ozone, the scent of the storm that had passed. He sat up, the fur throw pulled around his waist, and looked at Kalen, who was watching him from the window, his back to the atrium. "Thank you," Elian said, his voice quiet but clear. Kalen turned. The exhaustion of the last 3 days was evident in the shadows under his eyes, but his gaze was steady. "There is nothing to thank me for. I protected what is mine." The possessiveness in his tone should have been a warning, a red flag, but it didn't feel like ownership. It felt like a statement of fact, a declaration. Elian was his to protect, his to shelter. It was a cage still, but the door was now open, and Elian found he had no desire to leave. In that moment, he finally confessed the full truth of what he was, the final piece of the puzzle he had been withholding. "It's not just that they failed to suppress me," he said, his voice gaining strength. "It's why they failed. My biology doesn't just fight their suppressants. It metabolizes them. It learns from them. The genetic markers they were searching for, the ones that made me a failure. They're the key to a universal counter-agent, a cure." The air in the room went still. Kalen's eyes widened, almost imperceptibly. The implications were staggering. It wasn't just about exposing the syndicate's lies. It was about dismantling their primary tool of control. "You're saying," Kalen breathed, "that from your biology, a permanent inoculant could be synthesized, one that would free every Omega in the spire from chemical suppression?" Elian nodded. "My body is a living blueprint for their liberation. That is why my father, why Director Thorne, could not accept failure. It's why they cannot let me go. I am not just a runaway experiment. I am the key to the collapse of their entire social structure." The stakes had just escalated from a personal war to a revolution. Kalen stared at him, a whirlwind of calculations flashing behind his pale eyes. He saw the path forward, a dangerous, bloody road that could lead to freedom or annihilation. "Everyone has a price," he murmured, the words a distant echo of their first meeting. He crossed the room and stood before Elian, looking down at him. "They tried to buy control, to engineer obedience. They thought your price was submission." He reached out, his fingers gently tracing the line of Elian's jaw. The touch was no longer just grounding. It was charged with a new, potent emotion. "And what is your price, little ghost?" Elian leaned into the touch, his eyes holding Kalen's. His old self would have said freedom, survival, but that was no longer the whole truth. His price had changed. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice soft with a vulnerability that would have been unthinkable a week ago. "But I know it is no longer something I can achieve alone." Kalen's thumb stroked his skin, a slow, deliberate caress. "The syndicate will escalate," he said, his voice a low growl. "They know their time is running out. They will throw everything they have at us to get you back. They will burn the Merc to the ground." "I know," Elian said. There was no fear in his voice, only resolve. "Then we will have to burn brighter." Kalen's lips curved into that rare, dangerous smile, but this time it held a fierce, protective warmth. It was the smile of a king who had just found his cause, his queen, his revolution. He leaned down, his forehead resting against Elian's. The sense of ozone and petrichor mingled in the air between them. A storm, meeting the calm that follows. "Rest," Kalen whispered. The real fight is about to begin. The quiet intimacy of the aftermath was a fragile bubble, and they both knew it. The syndicate, having failed in their surgical strike, would not make the same mistake twice. They would come with overwhelming force. Kalen's network of spies and informants in the spire confirmed their fears. Massive troop movements, the mobilization of the Warden legions, the unmistakable signs of a full-scale military operation being staged under the guise of a containment protocol. The Merc held its breath. The usual chaos of the streets muted into a tense, watchful quiet. The forges burned hotter, turning out weapons and armor plating. The people of the Undercity, a disparate collection of survivors and outcasts, began to rally around their king, not just out of loyalty, but out of a shared, instinctual hatred for the sterile, oppressive world above that had discarded them. In the eye of the storm, in the quiet sanctuary of the West Wing, the bond between Kalen and Elian deepened into something unspoken but absolute. The formal distance was gone, replaced by an easy proximity. They moved around each other with a fluid grace, their conversations a shorthand of shared glances and half-finished sentences. The power dynamic had shifted from protector and protected to partners. Elian's sharp, analytical mind, once a tool for mere survival, became Kalen's greatest strategic asset. He pored over the data Syra's teams extracted from the captured Warden tech, identifying encrypted communication channels, logistical weaknesses, and command hierarchies. He saw the Syndicate not as a monolithic entity, but as a complex machine, and he began to identify the gears that, if broken, would cause the entire apparatus to grind to a halt. They rely on a centralized command, Elian explained one night, pointing to a holographic schematic projected over the desk. All Warden legions are slaved to the central command hub in the Spire's security sector. Their movements are coordinated by a single AI. It makes them efficient, predictable. But if we can sever that connection, they become a headless army, Kalen finished, his eyes gleaming with appreciation. Chaos in the ranks of the orderly. Exactly, Elian affirmed. They see chaos as a weakness. We can turn it into our greatest weapon. There were moments of quiet, too. Moments when the coming war faded into the background, and there was only the two of them. One afternoon, Kalen found Elian standing before the plasteel window, watching the rain that was now falling in the atrium, a programmed weather cycle. Elian had his hand pressed against the cool surface, his expression distant. "I never saw rain," he said softly, without turning. "I understood the meteorological principles, the data, but I never felt it." Kalen came to stand behind him, his presence a warm, solid weight. He didn't speak, just rested his hand over Elian's on the window. The simple contact was profound. Through Kalen's hand, Elian could feel the faint vibration of the water hitting the other side of the plasteel. It wasn't the same as feeling the rain on his skin, but it was close. It was a shared experience, a bridge between his past and his present. "When this is over," Kalen said, his voice a low murmur against Elian's ear, "I will take you to the surface, to a place where the sky is real, and you can feel the rain." Elian's breath hitched. He turned his head, his face so close to Kalen's that he could see the flecks of silver in his grey eyes. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, with the powerful magnetic pull that had been growing since the day they met. The sense of ozone and petrichor swirled, a perfect, balanced storm. Kalen's gaze dropped to Elian's lips. The temptation was a living thing in the space between them, but he resisted. It was not the time. A victory could not be claimed before the battle was won. The night before the attack, a strange calm descended on the forge. The preparations were complete. Every fighter was armed, every defensive position manned. There was nothing left to do but wait. Kalen found Elian not in the command center or at the desk buried in data, but back in his original room, the first one he had been given. He was standing in the center of the Spartan space, his eyes closed, as if trying to recall the ghost he had been when he first arrived. "Are you afraid?" Kalen asked from the doorway. Elian opened his eyes. They were clear, calm. "No," he said. "I was born in a state of clinical observation. I had been preparing for a final test my entire life. I just never knew what it was for." He looked at Kalen, a faint, sad smile touching his lips. "Before I met you, my only goal was to survive, to disappear. Now, Kalen prompted, stepping into the room. "Now, I want to live," Elian finished. The simple declaration held more weight than any battle plan. It was the heart of their rebellion. Kalen crossed the space between them. He stopped, his hands finding Elian's waist, pulling him close. "I once told you everyone has a price," Kalen said, his voice a low, rough whisper. It was the cynical truth of a man who had never found anything priceless. His hands tightened, his gaze intense, fierce. "I was wrong. Some things, some people, you don't buy. You fight for them. You burn worlds for them." He lowered his head, and this time he did not stop. He claimed Elian's lips in a kiss that was not gentle or hesitant. It was a brand, a vow. It was the fury of a king and the desperation of a survivor, a culmination of every shared glance, every charged silence, every moment of fear and defiance. It tasted of ozone and petrichor, of iron and rain. Elian's hands came up to clutch at Kalen's shoulders, his body molding against the Alpha's as he kissed him back with a startling, answering fire. It was not the kiss of a submissive Omega, but of an equal, a partner, a king in his own right. When they broke apart, they were both breathless. "Whatever happens tomorrow," Elian said, his forehead pressed against Kalen's, "this was not a transaction. It was a choice." "I know," Kalen breathed. "It's the only choice that has ever mattered." They stood there for a long time, two kings in the heart of a rust-iron fortress, on the eve of a war that would either liberate a world or shatter it into dust. The silence between them was no longer an absence, but a promise. The first tremor was not a sound, but a vibration felt deep in the bones of the forge, a low, seismic hum of an immense force gathering at their gates. Dawn had not yet broken, but the smog-choked sky above the murk was beginning to glow with an unnatural, sterile white light, the light of the Syndicate. On the central command dais, surrounded by holographic displays showing the outer perimeter, Kalen stood like a statue carved from iron. Elian was at his side, a datapad in his hand, his eyes scanning the incoming data streams. Syra stood on his other side, her rifle held at a low ready, her optic eye glowing a malevolent red. "They're using sonic charges to breach the primary gates," Syra reported, her voice flat. "Estimated breach in 5 minutes." "Let them," Kalen said, his voice calm, resonant. "The entrance is a kill box. The first wave is a sacrifice. They know it, and so do we." Elian's fingers flew across the surface of his datapad. "I'm piggybacking their initial comms burst. The AI is coordinating 3 primary assault vectors. The gate is only one. They're also deploying aerial units to try and punch through the upper levels of the forge and sending sapper teams through the old aqueduct system below. They're arrogant, Kalen growled. They think they can fight a war on 3 fronts because they've never faced a unified resistance. He looked at Elian. Can you disrupt their comms? Not yet, Elian replied, his focus absolute. Their encryption is military grade, but every command the AI sends is a data packet, and every packet has a signature. I'm learning its language. A deafening explosion rocked the forge, sending a shower of dust and rust from the high ceiling. On the main display, the image from the front gate dissolved into static, then cleared to show a gaping, molten hole where the massive iron doors had been. A tide of white armored wardens began to pour through, their pulse rifles firing methodical, sweeping bursts. But the Merc answered with fire and fury. From hidden positions in the walls and gantries, heavy machine guns opened up, their projectile rounds tearing through the warden's pristine armor. Explosives detonated, turning the narrow entrance corridor into a charnel house. The first wave was annihilated in under a minute, but it was only the beginning. The sky outside the forge's high windows became a swarm of sleek, white warden assault craft. They swooped down like birds of prey, their cannons spitting plasma that melted through the iron plating of the roof. Kalen's anti-air defenses, salvaged and retrofitted missile launchers roared to life, painting the dark sky with fiery trails. Below, in the damp, echoing tunnels of the aqueducts, another fierce battle raged in close quarters. The sounds of war were a deafening symphony of destruction. For hours, the battle raged. The forge held, but the cost was high. Kalen's forces were fighting with a desperate ferocity, but the Syndicate's resources were seemingly endless. For every warden that fell, 2 more took its place. The cold, logical precision of their assault was relentless. Elian worked in a state of pure, cold focus, his mind a whirlwind of data. He was no longer just a man. He was a nerve center, a living processor plugged into the heart of the battle. He rerouted power, coordinated troop movements based on the enemy's predicted patterns, and continued his relentless assault on the warden's command AI. He felt a presence at his side and looked up to see Kalen, his face grim, a fresh gash bleeding on his cheek. They've breached the east sector, the Alpha said, his voice tight. And they've deployed something new, a sonic dampening field. It's neutralizing our comms in that area. My people are fighting blind. Elian's eyes narrowed. A dampening field. They're isolating a section of the battlefield. Why? His blood ran cold. It's not a tactical move. It's a capture protocol. They're trying to corner me. They were no longer just trying to reclaim their asset. They were trying to cut the head off the snake. Without Elian's strategic oversight, the Merc's defense would crumble. They're herding you, Kalen growled, his hand instinctively going to the hilt of the massive blade strapped to his back. I'm not leaving your side, he declared, his voice an iron vow. You must, Elian said, his voice sharp, commanding. He looked Kalen in the eye, his gaze unwavering. Your place is with your people, leading the fight. I am not a damsel to be guarded. I am a weapon. Let me be used as one. He turned back to his datapad. I've almost got it. The AI's command language. It has a flaw, a recursive loop in its threat assessment code. I can exploit it. I can turn their greatest strength into their biggest weakness. What do you need? Kalen asked, his trust in Elian absolute. Time, Elian said simply. And a distraction. A big one. Kalen's lips pulled back in a feral grin. A distraction is something I can provide. He turned to Syra. Seal the command center. No one gets in or out. Protect him with your life. Syra nodded, her optic eye flaring. With pleasure. Kalen clasped Elian's shoulder. A hard, brief squeeze. Burn bright, little ghost, he whispered. And then he was gone, his roar echoing through the corridors as he rallied his personal guard and charged toward the east sector, a king leading his army to war. Left alone with only the hum of the computers and the distant sounds of battle, Elian's fingers became a blur. He found the flaw in the AI's code. He wrote a virus, a simple, elegant piece of malware designed to do one thing: redefine the primary threat. He would turn the wardens on themselves. As he prepared to upload it, a new sensation began to build within him. It was the deep, primal thrum of his own biology, the power he had kept leashed since his heat. The stress of the battle, the overwhelming sensory input, the proximity to death. It was all acting as a catalyst. The faint scent of petrichor and ozone that clung to him began to intensify, pouring off him in waves. It was no longer just a scent. It was a presence, a force. The air in the command center grew thick with it, charged and electric. The lights flickered. The terminals around him sparked. He felt a power coiling inside him, a raw, untamed energy that was screaming for release. It was the culmination of 22 years of suppression, a biological rebellion mirroring the physical one raging outside. The Syndicate had wanted to create a null Omega, a being of perfect control. In their failure, they had created something far more powerful, something wild. With a final keystroke, he unleashed the virus. The effect was instantaneous. On the tactical displays, the orderly red icons representing the Warden forces flickered, then began to move erratically. Squads started firing on each other. The relentless, logical advance dissolved into chaos. He had done it. He had severed the head of the machine. But the cost was immense. The power surging through him was too much. His vision swam. The sounds of the battle faded into a dull roar. His knees buckled. As he fell, the last thing he saw was the image of the forge, battered but holding, and the scent of the coming rain filled his entire world. The power erupted from him, a silent, concussive wave of pure pheromonal energy. It wasn't just a scent, it was a command, a declaration of being. It washed through the forge, over the battlefield, a wave of pure, untamed life in a war of sterile machinery. For the people of the Merc, it was a clarion call, a scent of wild freedom that galvanized their weary souls and fueled their defiance. For the Wardens, it was a system crash. Their suits were designed to filter out standard pheromones, but not this. This was an anomaly, a ghost in their machine. The raw organic signal overloaded their sensors, causing glitches, shutdowns, and sensory feedback loops. Alphas in their ranks, long suppressed by their own chemical inhibitors, felt a phantom echo of a dominant presence that was not their commander, and it caused a fatal hesitation. The tide of the battle didn't just turn, it broke. Kalen, fighting in the heart of the East Sector, felt it first. The wave of Elian's scent washed over him, a scent of storm and earth and impossible freedom. It was a beacon, a promise, and it filled him with a strength that was beyond physical. He roared, a sound of pure, triumphant fury, and carved a path through the disoriented, malfunctioning Wardens, his eyes fixed on the path back to the command center. back to Elian. The war was over. The silence that descended in the aftermath was heavier than any explosion. The Syndicate's forces, shattered and leaderless, had rooted. The Mreg had held. But the victory was written in scars on the iron walls of the forge and in the blood of its defenders. The cost had been grievous, but they had won. They had won. Kalen found him where Sira had said he would be, on the floor of the command center, surrounded by sparking terminals. He was pale, motionless, his breathing shallow. The overwhelming scent had faded, leaving only the soft, clean smell of rain clinging to him. Kalen knelt, his heart a cold knot of fear in his chest. He gathered Elian into his arms, the slight frame feeling terrifyingly fragile. "Elian," he whispered, his voice rough with smoke and emotion. "Elian, stay with me." He carried him from the wreckage of the command center, through the corridors filled with the weary, wounded, but victorious people of the Mreg. They parted before him, their expressions a mixture of awe and reverence for the king and the pale, scentless Omega who had become their salvation. He took him back to the West Wing, to the quiet sanctuary of the atrium. The biome was damaged, the plasteel window cracked, but the waterfall still flowed, and the moss still pulsed with its soft blue light. He laid Elian on the bed and simply watched him, his hand gripping Elian's, willing his own strength, his own life, into the still form. For a day and a night, Elian did not wake. The forge's best medics, scrappy back-alley doctors with more practical experience than any Spire physician, could find nothing physically wrong with him. He had simply burned out. He had poured every ounce of his latent power, his life force, into that final, desperate act. On the second morning, as the first hints of the Mrg's artificial dawn filtered through the cracked window, Elian's eyelids fluttered. He took a breath, a deep, shuddering gasp, and his eyes opened. They found Kalen's immediately. "Did we win?" he whispered, his voice a dry rasp. A slow, relieved smile spread across Kalen's face. He squeezed Elian's hand. "We burned brighter," he said softly. Recovery was slow. The Syndicate, humiliated and broken, had retreated to its ivory tower, its internal power structure in chaos. The rebellion that Elian had started with a single act of defiance had sent shockwaves through their perfect system. Whispers of a cure, of a scentless Omega who had brought the Wardens to their knees, began to spread through the Spire's lower levels. The seeds were sown. The world had changed. Elian, for his part, was content to heal. The quiet of the atrium was no longer a cage, but a haven. He and Kalen spent their days in a state of peaceful domesticity that was a stark contrast to the violence that had brought them together. They ate their meals together, talked for hours, or simply sat in comfortable silence, Kalen managing the slow rebuilding of his empire from a datapad, while Elian read or simply watched the waterfall. The physical and emotional connection between them was a constant, low thrum, a bond forged in fire and tempered in peace. It was a bond not of designation, not of Alpha and Omega, but of two souls who had found their other half in the most unlikely of circumstances. One evening, weeks later, when Elian had regained his strength, they stood on the highest balcony of the forge, looking out over the sprawling, wounded, but vibrant expanse of the Mreg. The neon lights flickered below, and the familiar sounds of life, of commerce and community had returned. "You once offered me your empire," Elian said, his voice quiet in the night air. He turned to look at Kalen, his expression serene in the glow of the city below. Kalen met his gaze, his pale eyes soft. "I did." "I don't want it," Elian said. Kalen's brow furrowed in confusion. "Then what do you want?" he asked. "The price is yours to name. Anything." Elian smiled, a true, genuine smile that lit up his face. "You made me a promise," he said. "You promised to take me to the surface, to a place where the sky is real." He reached out and took Kalen's hand, his fingers lacing with the alphas. "I want to feel the rain." Kalen looked at their joined hands, then back at Elian's hopeful, expectant face. He saw not a runaway experiment, not a strategic asset, not a revolutionary icon. He saw the man he loved, the man for whom he would burn worlds and for whom he would build new ones. He brought Elian's hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to his knuckles. "Then we'll go," he said, his voice thick with a promise that was more binding than any law, more absolute than any command. "We'll go, and we'll watch the storms together." They stood in silence, watching the city they had saved, two kings looking toward a future that was no longer a matter of survival, but a horizon of infinite possibility. The price had been paid, not with currency or power, but with the choice to live, to love, and to be free. And it was priceless.